on November 8th and passed the alert and orders to resist the invasion. By noon, Bethouar was arrested, his abortive uprising put down, and Nogues and Darlan freed. At 0:30 a.m. on November 8th, Patton's soldiers began loading into landing craft from troop ships positioned 8 miles offshore. With the first light expected at 5:30 a.m. and sunrise at 7 a.m., the time to move to the shore was set for 3:30 a.m. However, operations in total darkness and heavy swells pushed the jump-off time back almost an hour. Once loaded the landing craft and tank, lighters moved to the line of departure 4,000 yards from the shore, from where it was supposed to take 15-20 minutes to land. The landings were to commence without preparatory naval and air bombardment, because Eisenhower wanted to avoid a confrontation between the erstwhile allies. The signal from the French that there would be no resistance was the French searchlight, elevated to the vertical. All ships and aircraft received orders not to fire unless fired upon or in the face of imminent hostile action. American commanders worked out a signal system using American baseball terminology. Batter up meant I am being fired upon, and play ball was an order to open fire. With no indications of French intentions by 4:30 a.m., Hewitt ordered the first wave of Higgins boats, landing craft, vehicle personnel LCVP, and tank lighters escorted by destroyers to proceed to their designated landing zones. Minesweepers began laying anti-submarine minefields north of Port Lyautey and south of Safi, while destroyers screened the outer perimeter of the task force against submarine attacks. Converted destroyer transports USS Bernadou and USS Cole, carrying K&L companies and infantry regiment, raced ahead of the first wave at Safi. They were fired upon by shore defenses as they entered the harbor, and signaled batter up, reports which were relayed to Rear Admiral Lyle Davidson, commander of the Southern Attack Group. Without waiting for acknowledgement, one of the escort destroyers, USS Mervine, and machine gunners on the landing craft returned fire. When the play ball command was given, the battleship New York and cruiser Philadelphia began pounding the shore batteries. Infantrymen from K&L companies went ashore at 4:45 a.m. and quickly captured port facilities. Opposition from the French garrison, numbering less than 1,000 men, was minimal. There were few casualties among the U.S. Army troops, although a significant number of landing craft, primarily made of wood, were damaged or destroyed on the rocky shore. Destroyer Mervyn suffered minor damage to its steering gear from a near miss by a shore battery. By 3:30 p.m., all of Safi was in American hands. Almost immediately, batter-up reports began coming in as French anti-aircraft guns opened fire on American aircraft in the north around Port Lyautey Rabat area. Almost immediately, batter-up reports began coming in as French anti-aircraft guns opened fire on American aircraft in the north around Port Lyautey Rabat area. At the command of Playball, American fighters engaged their French counterparts coming up to meet them, as American dive bombers attacked French aircraft still on the ground. Supported by naval gunfire and aircraft, troops from the Northern Attack Group began coming ashore. As at Safi, opposition was light, and by 11 a.m. the Port Lyautey area was secured, and the Army P-40F Warhawk fighters began landing at the captured airfields. As the landings at Port Lyautey commenced, a French armed sloop Victoria, escorting 2 steamers, blundered into the northern screening force. Ignoring the warning shots from the minesweeper USS Hogan, Victoria opened fire. The return fire from Hogan killed its gunnery officer and forced the French ships to beach. At the site of main American landings at Fadala, the French shore batteries, the most powerful of which mounted 4 5.4-inch guns with a range of up to 11 miles, opened fire in the dawning light. Cruisers Wichita and Tuscaloosa, hovering at the extreme range of French guns, returned fire after receiving permission to play ball. The landing beaches at Fadala, 12 nautical miles from Casablanca Harbor, were well within the range of El Hank Battery and Jean Bart's guns, which joined the fray. They, in turn, were engaged by cruisers Augusta and Brooklyn and destroyers Wilkes, Swanson, Ludlow, and Murphy. Fighters from Ranger and Suwannee quickly established air superiority as American bombers attacked French shore batteries and ships in the harbor. The Massachusetts scored multiple hits on Jean Bart, but most of its shells, as discovered later, failed to detonate due to faulty fuses. One round, however, hit Jean Bar's only operational turret and jammed its drivetrain, rendering the turret inoperable. 3 French submarines and 3 passenger ships, fortunately with no passengers aboard, were sunk at their piers. French return fire, although spirited, was largely ineffective. A hit on the destroyer USS Murphy opposite Fedallah killed 3 sailors and damaged an engine, and the minesweeper USS Palmer suffered minor damage from 2 hits. Around 8 a.m., 6 French destroyers sortied from Casablanca harbor and headed for Fedallah to attack troopships. They managed to damage several landing craft before being intercepted by U.S. destroyers Wilkes and Ludlow. French destroyer Myland dueled with Wilkes, scoring hits on each other before the arrival of cruisers Augusta and Brooklyn forced the French vessels back. Shortly after 10 a.m., the light cruiser Primogate and several submarines on the French side and Massachusetts and Tuscaloosa joined the action. French destroyers Fougueux and Boulonnais succumbed to multiple hits and went down. Augusta took a hit from El Hank Battery, but the damage was minor. Despite multiple French torpedoes in the water, none of the American ships were hit. Deftly maneuvering American ships avoided the worst of French fire, although there were a few close calls. I was on the main deck when a shell hit so close it splashed water all over me. And later on the bridge, one hit even closer. I was too high to get wet, Patton remembered. It was hazy and the enemy used smoke well. I could just see them and make out our, splashes with our ships firing, like hell and going in big zigzags and curves to keep the enemy from our subs. By noon, outgunned and strafed by aircraft, French vessels were getting the worst of it. The cruiser Primogate and destroyers Milan, Frondeur and Brestois were heavily damaged, disengaged and retreated to port. Destroyer Albatross, its engines damaged, was left behind. Of the 7 French vessels engaged, only l'Alcyon returned to port undamaged. Very few American landing craft were damaged or destroyed by French fire or strafing by aircraft. However, heavy waves capsized some boats while others dashed apart on rocky beaches. Over 100 landing craft were damaged or destroyed on November 8th. Such high loss of landing assets severely delayed American ground forces coming ashore. Nevertheless, sufficient troops landed to overcome Fedallah's garrison of 2,000, and by noon the town was in American hands. Around 12:45, the French armed dispatch vessel La Grandière, 2 minesweepers, and a tug left Casablanca harbor to rescue survivors at Fedallah. However, their foray was viewed as hostile and fired upon. The tug took Albatross in tow, but, attacked by American fighters, beached the wounded vessel. Primogate and Milan barely limped to port and settled on the shallow bottom. In the late evening, destroyers Brestois and Frondeur were finished off by aircraft from Ranger and sunk in the harbor. The 2nd Light Cruiser Squadron was effectively out of action, with only destroyers Tempête and Simoun, which did not engage in the morning, remaining operational in addition to l'Alcyon. Despite the valiant efforts by the French, the action on November 8 was overwhelmingly one-sided. Of the 4 American ships hit by French shells, none suffered serious damage, and only 3 sailors were killed on Murphy. 6 American aircraft were lost at the cost of more than 20 French planes shot down and a roughly equal number destroyed on the ground. 3 French submarines were sunk in the harbor, and 8 sortied to meet the Americans. They launched 20 torpedoes at American vessels with no hits. Of the 8 French subs, 3 were sunk by depth charges. 1 damaged and beached. 1 escaped to Cadiz, Spain, and 2 to French-held Dakar in Senegal. Only 1 Orphy made it back to Casablanca undamaged. American vessels, other than providing gunfire and air support, were not engaged with their French counterparts on November 9th. On November 10th, 2 French corvettes sortied from Casablanca harbor to fire on American troops, advancing along the shore from Fedallah. As Augusta and 4 American destroyers drove off the French ships, the turret on Jean Bart came alive. The French had repaired the damages to its turret on November 9th, but left the guns in their prior position so that it appeared to be still out of action. Suddenly 2 huge orange splashes rose, so close alongside the bridge of the Augusta that I and others on the flag bridge were doused with the spray, wrote Hewitt. We promptly rang up full speed, put the rudder full right, made smoke and zigzagged away, but not before we had been near missed several times more by the Jean Bars. 2-gun salvos. Around 3 p.m., American SBD, Dauntless dive bombers scored 2 hits with 1,000-pound bombs on Jean Bart. The French battleship took on water and settled to the bottom of the harbor, with its guns elevated to an angle where they could not fire on American vessels. By the end of November 10th, American forces surrounded Casablanca. Everything was ready for the final assault the following day. At 5:30 a.m. on November 11th, Patton sent a captured French officer to Michelieu with emphatic demands to surrender immediately or be destroyed. Unbeknown to Michelieu, Darlan was captured by Americans on November 10th in a deal with Eisenhower in exchange for being recognized as a French High Commissioner and commander of French forces in Africa. Darlan signed an armistice and ordered the French forces to surrender and cooperate with the Allies. Patton's demands coincided with orders relayed to Michelieu by Darlan, who was seconded by General Nogues, also captured by Americans and brought to Casablanca. By 7 a.m., Michelieu ordered his forces to lay down their arms, and Casablanca was fully occupied by 11 a.m. At 2 o'clock, Admiral Michelieu and General Nogues came to treat for terms, Patton wrote. I opened the conference by congratulating the French on their gallantry and closed with champagne and toasts. I also gave them a guard of honor. No use in kicking a man when he's down. On the evening of November 11th, 2 German submarines arrived at Casablanca. Shortly before 8 p.m., the U-103 under Oberleutnant zur See Hans Adolf Schweichel, hugging the shallow waters off the coast, snuck in between the minefield and the shore and fired 5 torpedoes, all of which hit the transport USS Joseph Hughes, tanker USS Winooski, and destroyer USS Hambleton. Most of the troops from Joseph Hughes had already come ashore, but approximately 100 men died, including its captain, Robert Smith. The Winooski and Hambleton remained afloat. A torpedo hit Winooski on an empty fuel compartment, and the ship continued operations. The Hambleton suffered serious damage to its engine room and 20 men were killed. She was towed to Casablanca Harbor and eventually returned to the United States.